Classic Restos is proudly brought to you by Shannons Insurance, where you can be a member of the Shannons Club. Pace Farm, the enjoyable egg. Hare and Forbes Machinery House. And Gun Lake Quarries.
All of my classic cars are very special to me, but if there's one resto that I'm extra proud of in a different way, it would have to be my 1969 Dodge Dart GT Sport Replica. And you're about to see it on this week's episode of Classic Restos. So here we are, right, in 2006, and there was just something about the two-door valves, the VF and VG Coupe. I really admired their shape, and they looked different. And the reason that they were so different is because they were American-inspired Dodges, and they only ran a couple of years in this country. They ran a VF and a VG, 69 and 70, and the shape, it always... I guess it always encouraged me to want one because of the way they look, their shape. I think the squareness of these cars, very masculine. They're tough looking, and around about 2006, the price of these things hadn't really been discovered. They were still a low price car. I noticed the car's potential, I noticed the potential amongst the enthusiasts and thought, I better act now, I better jump and try and get one of these cars. Would you believe, online, there it was sitting down the south coast, and a young girl was driving it. She was driving it backwards and forwards to university. It had a slant 6 in it, a very tied slant. As soon as I pulled up and looked through the windscreen at it sitting over on the grass, straight away I said to myself, I'm driving this car home. You know, it's that sort of a feeling. It was kind of like as soon as you see it, you knew you were going to get it. And that's the feeling of excitement that I had. Apprehensive, the drive down the south coast on the day, I could remember, oh, what happens if I get down there and the doors are puffy and it's got rust in it and all this sort of stuff. And you know, you kind of expect that when you're looking at some of these old cars. But there it was, sitting there, and as straight as anything, the door gaps were perfect. This was a clean car. It really was a clean car. And the slant in it at the time, it was just blowing so much smoke. The poor old girl was so tired. I remember driving it over the mountains and back to the Southern Highlands here in New South Wales, and look, you know, 60 miles an hour was about all it wanted to do on the way home. But it was still running as smooth as silk. The same car, you could have driven to Adelaide and back. It was, that engine just kept going and going. I can remember where the heater hoses came through the firewall, the rubber grommet had gone, and coming up the mountains, the cab started filling up with smoke, and it was pretty hilarious because both windows were down. I slowed right down pretty slow to come up the mountain because I just nursed it coming home. It was an interesting time too where around about the mid-2000s, as I said, I may have alluded to earlier, that the emphasis of keeping a car original didn't seem to be in the spotlight anywhere near today. There's a big emphasis these days on finding these cars original and keeping them that way. Back in those days, to get one and modify it was quite the norm. You'd put another engine in them, you'd give them a nice paint job and basically restore the car back to new, but you'd lose the original matching engine numbers, you'd change the paint colour, and you'd end up with I guess your own car, and that's exactly what I did here. One thing I always had as inspiration was the picture in my mind of how the car was going to look when it was finished. But I think that's important as well. Whether you're doing any type of restoration work, whether it's a custom or if you want to keep it original, it's going to be different no matter what after you finish with it. Even if you're just cutting it back with polish and doing the mechanicals, the car is still going to look, I guess, transformed in most cases to possibly when you buy it. A lot of these cars, ultimately barn finds is it's a very, I guess, an overdone term these days, but there's so much meaning in that because at the end of the day, every one of us want to find an old car or a classic bike or a classic truck that's been parked up for 30 years. That's the treasure. That's what we're all after. And if you can get something like that and you've got a little bit of history with it, that's even further bonus stuff. I guess the first thing which, you know, I knew in my mind it was going to be stripped back to a bare shell and sandblasted, just like the CM. And in knowing that, that's where you really do find the true DNA of your car. Once, I mean, sandblasting doesn't muck around. It's got to be done by a guy that knows what he's doing too, because you could end up with a whole heap of Swiss cheese if you're not careful. It also generates a lot of heat too. It can buckle panels, and these have got a long rear quarter panel as well. Keeping in mind they're an A body. They're a compact car. They're by no means a full size car. They're just the right size when you put a good engine in them. Well, they've all got good engines in them, these things, but if you put a powerful plant in them, boy, you've got yourself a very, very towy bit of gear.
Now, this car just wasn't going to remain a VF Valiant. After the break, see how Fletch alters some Australian styling, transforming this Aussie Val back into a United States Dodge replica.
I spend a lot of time out here. The RT Charger's the real deal. An E49. Remember A-Charger? I've always got projects on the go, so Shannon's laid-up cover helps protect my restorations. I'm Mopar through and through. It's a passion Shannons understands. I wouldn't insure my cars and bikes with anyone else.
Shannons, insurance for motoring enthusiasts. Call 13 46 46 for a quote.
Hare & Forbes Machinery House has been family owned and operated for over 85 years, and it's easy to see why. Planning on welding? Look at these welding tables and clamps, air compressors and different air tools, sandblasting cabinets, through to spray guns. Everyone is welcome at Machinery House. There are competitive freight rates around Australia, and you can buy online at machineryhouse.com.au. So remember, Hare & Forbes has the range. Welcome back. Here I am in the chair. Now there's one thing that I've always said, if you're going to do something, you've got to do it right, whether it's a career or a hobby. And I was very inspired to transform this VF Val. I wanted to make it into something different. And you wouldn't read about it, probably around about 2004, 2005. I was looking through a book and reading about the Dodge Darts in the United States of America. And I realised that back then, that the 69, actually 67 and 69, through that period, Dodge Darts in the United States of America, were actually running the same front fenders as what we received in 68 on our VE Valiant. And I looked at that and thought, wow, wouldn't that be pretty cool to get those VE guards on there and let's do a replica car of the Dodge Dart. And I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to do this, I might as well go all the way and do the big daddy, which was the Dodge Dart GT Sport. So the first job was to try and find myself a pair of VE guards and a hood. And a good mate of mine was a Thorpe down in Goulburn, New South Wales. Back in the day, he had a whole paddock full of Valiants, and he was good enough to sell me the car. I forget what I paid for it. I bought this entire four-door VE. That was the donor car for the panels here for the Dodge. So before you start getting this lovely car that you've just bought, I'm going to cut the front off it. So you can imagine the measuring and the weeks and weeks of thinking going into this, because I didn't want to wreck my car, obviously. And It was funny enough because when I took the measurement from the firewall to the radiator support panel off a VE and then transferred that measurement onto the front of this, everything just worked out beautifully. And cutting a certain amount off the front of the car to accommodate the VE guards, it was funny how the radiator support panel just bolted in just with a couple of bolts to hold it in place for the sake of the exercise. It looked perfect. And of course, because that is the way it was in the United States. We just added a bit on the front and put some longer guards on. So basically this car was just taken back to how it was in the US. Another feature of the Dodge Dart GT Sport as well is of course the humps on the hood. Now this is another interesting thing, and I got a lot of excitement out of researching this. The frame of the hood that we had here on the VE was exactly the same as what was in the United States of America, with a plain skin. Now anyone with one of these valves, if you pop your hood and look down the frame, you'll see cutout sections down on the inside of the frame. Now again, that was to access the speed nuts to hold the die-cast insignias onto the top of the humps, indicating a 344 barrel. These are a two-piece die-cast. They weigh a lot. They're quite heavy. So where was I going to get one of these hoods? Well, that was hard even in the 2000s. To cut a long story short, I found a guy in the United States that had a damaged hood, and he actually cut the hump sections out and retained the back edge so that my welder couldn't go wrong with them. You couldn't go wrong in positioning them, because where do you put them? Do they go that way, and how far back and how far forward? You've got to have them positioned spot on. So they were cut in such a way that we couldn't go wrong, lining them up to fuzz them in. The American grille fitted nicely on the front of the radiator support panel. The brackets were utilised for it. They just had to be bent a couple of different places here and there for memory. Interesting with the guards, I know I mentioned earlier about you can't put VE guards on the front of a VF or a VG, and there's a reason for this. If you look at the front of a VE, the top of the inner skirt comes along straight, and the guard on a VE is straight. If you look at the inside of a VF or a VG guard, towards the front they go down, that they shape downwards, so they have a shape in them. Now obviously the front of this car, when you remove the VF guards, you had this dip in the top of the inner skirt. Now if you tried to put a VE guard on that, number one, the VE guards are shorter, so even if you chop some off the front and put it on, you're going to have a gap, which is just rough. You wouldn't do that. That's just a rough bloke's way of doing it. So what you've got to do is restore the top of that inner skirt to the VE equivalent, which also means moving the radiator support panel back, because the VF and VG guards were in fact longer than the VE guards. So essentially it's VE sheet metal on the front of a VF car. Notice the straight edge here on the VE guard. On a VF and VG, around about this point, it steps down. So the front of the sheet metal of the inner skirt here, that's the section where it has to be stepped up to meet the VE panel. Moving the radiator support panel back, yeah, that's one thing, but then what do you do with your bumper bar bolts? Because, you know, if you move something back, well, something stays forward. So you can't have a car with this big bar sticking way out the front. So whatever you took off the radiator support, the frame, sorry, to move the radiator support panel back, the female threads on the front part of the chassis rail had to go back as well. So that meant a piece of 10mm flat bar welded in there on the rail and tapped and threaded to relocate the bumper bar bolts for the bracket as well. This was a very special car to me in light of me doing this restoration, because it was a modification. it's also probably one of the only cars on the Australian market that you could actually take back to an American spec. Like, you can't buy a HQ and take it back to a Pontiac. I guess the early Falcons, an XK, would be there in that same parameter, but it was just luck. It was just pure luck that a 69 VF, you can make it into a dart. There's some things that have retained from the Australian design. I kept the Australian dash speedo cluster in place. I could have gone all out. I could have made it a left-hand drive car, but for the sake of registration and what have you, it was just easier to keep it as a VF. The vinyl grain on the door cards, that's all how it was here in 69. So when I say a replica, well, you know, I've got it as close as I can, I guess. One thing I have done is I put a set of SS Commodore seats in the car. Again, look, it's a bolt-in thing. It's been engineered. If you don't like them, take them out and put your original ones back in. So at the end of the day, it's not, to me, you know, it's not the end of the world of altering a car in that way. The steering wheel, that's something different as well. I think from memory, the wheel is out of a VC. It's got this beautiful short little shifter for the auto. And I love that. It's chrome, it's nice, it's got an ivory coloured knob on there. And I don't know, that sort of, although it was an Australian design, is very American in a lot of ways. I also love the colour, the dark, well, the Burgundy Red has always been a bit of a Fletch favourite. Something about a Burgundy Red car and a black vinyl roof. The car didn't have a vinyl roof when I bought it, so that was part of the custom work on this car as well. I thought, no, I'll go and put a vinyl roof on it. I had Buckley's of being able to afford a factory GT Sport. I couldn't afford one now. I'd be having myself on. To try and find a 340 with a Hurst shifter, 69 Dodge Dart GT Sport, no, that'd be out of my price bracket. Absolutely. And if you're looking for a 383 or a big block car, forget it. In terms of what I would be willing to spend or being able to spend, they're a fairly high priced car now. So I guess I've got best of both worlds here. Structurally, I've still got technically the same car. I'll tell you a little bit more about the mechanical side after the break.
I was 16 when I first saw her. Loved her utterly. She was so sweet, so perfect, still is. She's got a whopping great two-stroke engine under that gorgeous aerodynamic body. Insurance? Well, Shannons, of course.
No one knows your passion like Shannons. That's why we offer special limited usage rates and even club plate cover. So call Shannons on 13 46 46. Shannons, insurance for motoring enthusiasts.
I know that your classic vehicle is very special to you. That's why it just has to be insured with Shannons. Why not pick up the phone and give Shannons a call for a quote and a chat on 134646. And if you're yet to discover the Shannons Club, there's a whole range there of entertainment awaiting you. For more information, visit shannons.com.au. Well, you don't have to be Einstein to work out that if you put a powerful engine in a light car, it's going to go good. And when I did this, the Dodge, I thought to myself, these were the bad boys on the block over in the United States. These were the cars that cooled off the hot ones at the traffic lights, and all these lines that you might have read, and the performance cars, and you know, they held their own. You know, they were running high 13s and 14-second quarter miles from the factory. You know, back in '69, which if you had a car today that did that, you'd still have a fast car. So we're talking a long time ago here. They were just so good. So I thought to myself, well, okay, I'm going to try and make this car as period correct as I possibly can. So I found actually a 1968 Virgin 340 block. So it hadn't been machined. It was an original block. And I thought, why don't I just do something different and put some bigger cubes into that? So a 340, if you put a 4-inch crank into that, it takes out to 416. It's got a bigger bore than a 360. If you put a 4-inch crank into a 360, it goes out to a 408. But because the 340 has a bigger bore than a 360, you throw a 4-inch crank in there, it goes out to 416. A roller cam, I thought it'd be nice in it as well. And being a roller cam and big cubes, didn't have to be big on the cam. So I kept the cam fairly small, but it just makes beautiful power. It's quite stout, it really is. We're looking at 433 horsepower, and that's all in at 5.1, 480 foot-pounds of torque, and that's in at 3.9. It's not the sort of engine that you've got to thrash to make go. This is the sort of engine where you can do everything on 3 or 4 mil of throttle. The power's just there. It's very muscly. It's a real stump puller. Very, very torquey indeed. I put an M1 intake on the top of it and a 600 Holly. These are only a light car, so at the end of the day, you don't want something too heavy over the front, and that's where these small blocks really perform well. Nice on the steering, they turn in nice because you haven't got that weight. I mean, I know to lift the hood and see a 426 Hemi sitting there, look, all day long, the aesthetic appeal of a Hemi, you can't beat that. There's just something about those elephant engines that they just look absolutely incredible. This engine here, funny enough, is 7 horsepower more than a stock 426 Hemi and 10 foot-pounds of torque less. So that'll give you some sort of an idea. So it's around the, well, you know, you could virtually say the power of a stock 426 Hemi in this car. It's got a big alloy radiator in it. I've got a sensor on there with the thermo fans that cut in and out just like a late model car. So you're not worrying about anything. You're not looking down and seeing the gauge in the boiling position, think, oh, I've got to switch a fan on. You know, it's all automatic and that works a treat. The driveline, I've left the 904 in there. It's not even running a 727. I've got a 904 and a Borg Warner diff. I'm not trying to be too pretentious here. It's I don't race the car, I don't flog the car. It's a 4-pin Borgie and it's running a 308 rear gear. I love the sound of this thing. It's just brilliant. It's just got a note, they've got a beautiful note about them, these Dodgers. And as for the wheels, well, you know me, I love my Steelies. Wider on rear than in front, just to give it that, you know, that bad boy street look, I guess. It's got a tough look about it. It's got a little bit of rake on it, just a little bit. I just wanted the car, I guess, stock for the time. There was the SS look, which stood for super stock, and I guess it's almost like a super stock kind of look. That's really what I wanted to try and achieve, but to keep it in the realms of a street car. The true superstock car had bigger pans and slick tyres and all this sort of stuff, and they were set up for racing. And so, you know, I wanted to try and find that happy medium of having the SS look, but being very street drivable as well. And that's what it does brilliantly. The feeling that I get when I drive this car, I suppose that you can just imagine what it would have been like back in the day to buy a muscle car in the late 60s. Any owner of a Dodge Dart GT Sport would surely have to be inspired by the man himself, the legend Mr. Norm from Grand Spalding Dodge in Chicago. Back in the late 1960s, Mr. Norm's dealership led sales for the entire United States of America. At that point, the Dart was available with a 340 V8, and Mr. Norm wanted to know where was the big block. A couple of his guys over the weekend installed one, and on Monday morning, that was a nice car. Mr. Norm took it down to the boys in engineering at Hamtramck in Detroit, and not long after that, the Dart was available with a 383. You can be a member of Mr. Norm's Sports Club, And there's a sticker on the back of this car to endorse it.
In the United States, only cosmetic changes from the 1967 Dart transformed the 1969 Dart, available in the Swinger, the Dart GT and the GT Sport, the GTS up on the centre of the hood, and that bumblebee striping wrapped around the back was Dodge's top trim level Dart and made this lightweight street fighter Dodge a competitor just like its big brothers and cousins from Mopar. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the factory gearheads at Dodge, or any other American manufacturer for that matter, realised that putting a large engine into a lighter car made it win almost every time on the racetrack. The Dodge styling department struck gold with the Dodge Dart in 1969, proving to be one of the most popular shaped darts ever made. You could get yourself a base model Dart with almost unbustable power from the Slant 6, a torquey 318 V8, or the feel of 350 horsepower from Dodge's 4-barrel 340 V8 with TorqueFlite Auto or a Hurst shifter. These cars didn't come with a whole heap of options. No one was interested in lugging around an extra 1,000 pounds of luxury items. They just wanted to get to the finishing line first. Only 3,326 Dodge Dart GTS two-door coupes were built.
Well, I hope you've really enjoyed this week's episode of Classic Restos. As I say at the end of every show, no matter where you're watching Classic Restos from, until next week, please ride and drive safe. I'm Fletch, and I thank you very much for watching.
You can like and follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ClassicRestosTV and watch catch-up episodes at shannons.com.au.
Classic Restos is proudly brought to you by Shannons Insurance, where you can be a member of the Shannons Club, Pace Farm the Enjoyable Egg, Hare and Forbes Machinery House, and Gun Lake Quarries.